So let's illuminate our first topic today, which is theory in practice. We'll take some theory, look at how it applies in practice. Contracting. Let's just start off with the theory of contracting before we look at how it appears in our practice, Rory.
Yes. Well, first of all, when I can remember when I started my counselling studies many, many years ago, I was quite surprised in contracting because I came from a commercial background, and contracting was about business. It was about, buying something, buying a house, you exchange your contracts. We buy a car, you contract. So I was kind of taken aback to find out that contracting was something in counselling, but it is actually one of the cornerstones of ethical practice. And contracting does have some kind of businessy elements in it. I guess if you're a private practitioner, that might be, fees and when they're paid. But generally speaking, in counselling, contracting is about transparency. It's about accountability. And it's also about diffusing power. Because when somebody comes to you as a client, be that in a simulated skills session in college, or be that as a qualified practitioner or a student practitioner working with clients, the contract gives a clear outline of things like confidentiality. So important. So clients can make an informed choice. And I think it's really interesting that as people go through their training, they may start off with a bit of a verbal contract, at kind of level 2, or the early stages, but it becomes an integral part of being a caring and competent therapist, allowing the client to know exactly what's on offer, exactly the time frame of what's on offer, and also the limits of confidentiality, so that clients can make an informed choice. And the ethical frameworks, every ethical framework talks about autonomy. It allows someone to look at that and say, I'm just clapping my hands here for those people who can't see, holding my hand up and holding an imaginary contract up and saying, this is what I'm being offered. Is it for me? And if it's not, then they can make an informed choice. It's such an important and integral part of our practices. And sometimes it's one that's sometimes maybe not given the focus it should do.
Yes. So from a theoretical point of view, we kind of get that. We're called upon by our ethical body to have a contract in place. It levels the playing field. As you said, Rory, it promotes autonomy from the client. Everybody understands what the rule of engagement are. You're going to have the time that you meet, when you meet, how long you're going to be meeting for, what medium you're going to be meeting over. So is that online, boundaries around that, as in I can't be contacted outside of our regular sessions, or I can under these circumstances, and this how it works. So it's basically the rule book or the instructions that the client has access to, so that it is a shared understanding of what plays out in therapy. So there's your theory on it. Now, for me, in practice, the truth of this is when you are in that room and the door is closed. I'm taking an in-person, in-the-room scenario here, just using it as an example, but it's the same on the telephone or online, however you're working. I'm going to use the room so that you've closed the door and you sit down in the chair, and opposite you is that client. You may look around and think that within that room is just yourself and that client, but the contract is there invisibly hanging between you and holding the boundaries and the rules of engagement of that relationship. So it's living within the interaction. So it's very much there within your practice when you are working. And for me, I think a contract is a living document. And what do I mean by a living document? Well, as legislation might change, or external factors might change, or ethical frameworks may change their ethical frameworks by ethical bodies might change. So we would go back to our contract and they would change. So I graduated many years ago, but if I was in practice right now, I would certainly not be using the same contract. Since then, legislation has changed, GDPR has come into effect, so much has happened. There is the larger of the ethical bodies in the United Kingdom have changed their rules around supervision and online working. and their frameworks around that. So there's a lot of change, and it's a living document in that it changes. I think for me also, it is a living document in that it changes according to you and your practice. So if you are running your practice, you will consider beforehand what you will put in your contract. But you may find as you're going through the arc of therapy that something crops up in a session that you didn't expect, that you didn't account for, that you didn't plan for. And afterwards, you're going to take that to supervision and say what happened. But there's always the question I always ask myself is, what can I do? Can I go back to my contract? Is there anything I can add or expand on in my contract that would cover this? And I'll give you a very basic example. You might in your contract say that we meet for 1 hour and we meet on a Thursday from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock. And that might be your time allocation for a client as an example. It may well be that the client arrives 20 minutes late for the session. And you might say to them, okay, well, we did say that it was from this time to this time, and then you can bring the contract back into the room. But afterwards, you might think about, okay, what can I put into my contract to cover if you're going to be late? So you may say, well, you're 20 minutes late, and the client may say, well, traffic was just at an absolute standstill. It's not their fault. They didn't do it purposely. And then in reconsidering your contract, you might put in a line that if you are going to be late and it is safe to do so, you might send me a text on the following number. And there's just an example of how something cropping up within practice might inform a change in your contract.
Yeah, I like the way you've alluded to contracts being changeable living documents. And I think certainly when I went into private practice, I took the contracts I had as a agency practitioner, and I had to have a good look at it, because there were certain things that the agency asked for that I didn't have to ask for as a private practitioner. One, if my memory serves me right, was doing reporting forms. So the agency had funders. Funders wanted to know certain things about how therapy was progressing, and that was done with a tick box form, a very simple tick box form. Well, I didn't need to do that. And also, of course, the law change. We went from, certainly here in the UK, the Data Protection Act of 1998 to General Data Protection Regulations of 2018. So that had to be rewritten. And I'm conscious, Ken, that we have an international listener who listens in, and the laws in your country would go into your contracts. The laws in the UK may not be applicable to laws in your country. So have a look at laws in your country. And one of the other aspects of the contract, you've talked about boundaries and how you're saying that the therapy takes place at this time and this time only, which is fine. But if there was ever a complaint put against a therapist, one of the things that the ethical body would ask for would be, what is your contract? What is your contract? And if you've not, there's the old saying in services, if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. And when I started, verbal contracting was really what everybody did. In fact, my tutor said, you don't really have to have a written contract. Nowadays, I think it's essential, from my point of view anyway, to have a written contract, and client gets a copy, and you make sure the client can understand the contract. So it should be written in very easy to access language, and in the language that a client can understand. If you've got a client who's not an English speaker, then I think there's the principal position there of having your contract translated into language they can speak. And I'm sure a lot of people have done that. But they are so important. And I want to discuss something that is sometimes people struggle with as therapists, I think, and that's power. Because contracting gives you the opportunity to use power. We've talked about power many times in the contracts, and power's pretty benign. It's how it's used, it's how it's applied. And with a contract, you have a power to be able to take a decision in practice that may make a big difference to someone. So some people would have in their contract harm to self and harm to others. And if a client came in and said, I'm going to, do X, Y, and Z to A, B, and C, and they had a plan and they were going to do it, then as a therapist, you could break confidentiality. We both understood the limits of the contract. You may save someone's life. You may save the client's life in terms of, a client may be talking about taking their own life. And, if you have that built into your contract, if I believe you're going to harm yourself or others, you can use that power that's within the contract maybe to help and allow the client a little bit more time to consider their position. And I think that's something that really isn't talked a lot about in terms of contracts, and it gives you the ability to use power in a positive way.
It's interesting that you say that, Rory, because as you're saying that, it's a seesaw for me, because yes, we need to have that initial power used for the forces of good to create that protective bubble and that environment. And there are just legislation and things outside of our control that we don't choose, that we have to comply with, like legislation that we need to share with the client. And I guess there's a power imbalance in that, because we're saying this is how it's going to be. This is it. I've written it down here. And but at the same time, it balances the power, because it gives the client the full understanding of what is an offer. They have the right at any stage to go, you know what, no, I don't agree to this, and I'm not going to take part in therapy with you, which means that they have the choice of entering into this. And it depends on your modality, but you may be working with a modality like person-centered, where the client directs the way within therapy. Well, of course, within the contracting, that is not so. It can't be so, because we have to put that over. We have to contract. But I guess at the same time, it is person-centered, because we're saying, do you understand that? Is there any questions you may have about that? Are you okay to proceed within the parameters of this contract? So it is person-centered, I guess. And what you said, Rory, in terms of if there is a complaint laid, the first document you're going to be asked to produce is your contract. And I guess the second part of that is to evidence in some way that contract was shared with the client and it was accepted by the client. And that can be tricky. And I know we train counselors in online and phone counseling. We have for a number of years now. And contracting is very much a part of that training, because contracting when working online or via phone or via a digital technology will differ from a in-person, in the same room, face-to-face interaction. And in terms of the challenge that might come up there is, how do you evidence that you shared this? How do you evidence that the client agreed to it? So if you're in the room face to face, they can sign it. But if you're working online or via telephone, how is that done? And of course, there are digital technologies available now where you can send a digital copy of something. The client can read over that and they can digitally sign that and send it back. And it carries almost a watermark that evidences that they did see it and that they did sign that. And there are apps that you can go and look. If you look digital signature apps, you will find them available. One is called DocuSign. We don't endorse that. It's just a keyword that kind of to start your own research on that one. But it is, you would, if there is a complaint, you would be asked to produce your contract and evidence that you shared that with the client, that they saw that. And I think if there's a challenge that comes from this, it is, if it's been some time since you last took the contract out and had a look at it, get it out, take it into your next supervision session, take in your contract and say, I just want to relook at my contract, and get a peer and another set of eyes looking at your contract with you, and be asking the question, is it fully compliant? Does it cover everything that it needs to cover? And does it reflect the modern times? I think that there's richness in revisiting one's contract from time to time.
Absolutely, Ken. And when we talk about revisiting, we can revisit the contract with our clients. So sometimes clients present and they're in quite deep distress.
Yeah.
And I've done sessions where I've had clients who've been distraught for virtually the entire session, and I've always tried to at least get the non-negotiables of contracts across. Things like, certainly for the UK, Prevention of Terrorism Act, and I think it's principle just to say, how I approach it, because I kind of have a light way, try to have a light way of doing it. I'll say there are some things that we need to do. I can see that you're distressed, but one of them is confidentiality. And if you say anything that I believe may be an act of terrorism, not that I've had any clients who are terrorists, that type of approach, then I'd have to disclose it. And then you can come back on the next session and revisit it. And I always say I did it in my own practice. And when I taught, I said to my students, look, do the contract on the first session, but return to it in the second session and say, we did a contract last week. Have you got any questions, anything you want to ask? And, if something comes up, then just tell me, and we can speak about it. Make the contract something that can be discussed in therapy. It's not this is how it's going to be. This is what you have to do. And there's no more discussion about it. And the truth of the matter is, very few clients question the contract. They're more interested in trying to find, a solution for what's on their worried mind, which is why we have to, keep in our minds, is our contract ethical? Is it fair? Does it reflect the current legislation? Supervision, peer review, as Ken said, is essential to keep the contracts fresh and in service of the client.
Yeah, very, very much. So it's an important topic. And I think we've covered some interesting aspects of that. And, in face to face in the room, it may well be that when that client arrives that very first time, it's the first time you see them, as Rory has kind of alluded to there. Sometimes a client will come in and they want to share their material, and we need to kind of pause that slightly and introduce the contract. It's always good practice to allow the client to take the contract away, read through it in their own time, have a think about it. And of course, in today's age, with the technology we have, there is the opportunity to send the contract pre-session. Pre-session, if you can get a copy of the contract to a client before they even interact with you via email. And if you offer a free session, now, if you go back to our last episode, 242, in this very slot, in a practice partner, we spoke about the journey from an inquiry to somebody becoming a client. And part of that might be that you do a 20-minute session to kind of feel one another out. And it would be okay at that session to say, this is the contract that I work with. I wouldn't go into any great detail there. I would maybe glance over that, but give it to the client and say, take that away, have a good read of that. If you do choose to come back and engage with me, we'll look over it together and see if you have any questions. But it gives them that opportunity of not seeing it for the first time when they're in the room with you. It can take a client maybe by surprise that there is a contract. You started this topic, Rory, by saying how surprised you were as a student of counselling when you found out there were contracts in counselling. So how much more surprising? And why should a client know? We don't presume. We go, well, hello and welcome, and this is the counselling contract, because we're in our frame of reference. This is an everyday event. We're going to softly introduce that in a kind way. There it is. I think the challenge there is go and review your own contract. If you're training, think about contracting. There is, of course, a Rory super duper handout on contracting, and this is on the theory of contracting. It's going to cover what should be in a contract or some of the items, but I think it's really important to note that a contract is going to be as varied and different as your practice is. There are going to be similarities with other contracts, but you're going to be covering how you work and what your practice entails. And that's why when I see kind of messages on Facebook saying, can somebody share their contract with me? I need a contract. Just be wary of using somebody else's contract. You can pick out some of those elements that are going to be the same, but have a think about you your practice, the uniqueness of that, and what do you bring to it? Even if you're a student, even if you're in placement, generally in placement, you might be working with an agency contract. Did you look through that beforehand? Do you agree with that? Are you fluent at explaining that and putting that over to the client in a kind way and in an understanding way to ensure they get it and that they know what they're entering into? Because it's your practice. Even if you're working in an agency and you're using their contract, is you and your practice within that agency. So you want to be comfortable with that. So where do we get the super duper handout? You go to counsellingtutor.com, and very top of the page, that's our mother website, you're going to find a tab that says podcasts. Click on the podcast tab, find your way to episode 243. Right there on that page, we have our show notes where we speak about this episode. We have external links to build out the topics that Rory and I discuss. And right there within that page, you can download super duper handout